The radio man who rewrote war. How one unauthorized wire changed naval history forever. The destroyers hull groaned against Atlantic swells. Ice crystallized on every exposed surface. Inside the communications room, hunched over equipment that glowed red in the darkness, Tommy Sullivan watched something impossible appear on his receiver, a signal that military doctrine said couldn't exist, transmitted by submarines that shouldn't be detectable, picked up by an antenna he'd installed 3 days earlier without telling anyone. It was 2:47 in the morning, February 12, 1943, 340 miles west of Iceland, where the North Atlantic becomes a graveyard, where water temperature drops below freezing and men die in minutes, where German submarines hunted in packs and Allied convoys bled ships like open wounds across the ocean. Sullivan's hands moved across the controls. The signal strengthened, northeast bearing 10 miles out. A U-boat breaking radio silence ahead of the convoy. 43 merchant ships carrying 8,000 troops and enough ammunition to supply 3 infantry divisions for 6 months of combat. Standard procedure said wait for confirmed contact. Standard equipment said his jury-rigged vertical antenna violated every regulation in the Navy Communications Manual. Standard doctrine said submarines maintain radio silence during approach, making early detection impossible. Sullivan had stopped trusting Standard anything after watching Morrison die. The signal pulsed again, brief, cautious, a second U-boat coordinating position, then a third. Sullivan's modified antenna was detecting a Wolfpack forming ahead of the convoy, submarines arranging themselves for slaughter, completely unaware that a Cleveland radio man with backwards wiring had just turned hunters into prey. In the next 6 hours, his upside-down thinking would detect 11 submarines before they reached attack position, sink 4, scatter 7, and save every single ship in the convoy. 0 Allied losses, perfect defense achieved through equipment that was supposed to exist and tactics that violated every chapter of the doctrine manual. But understanding how one unauthorized wire antenna rewrote submarine warfare requires going back to a Cleveland shipyard district where a 12-year-old boy learned that textbooks explain what should work, while mechanics discover what actually does. The smell of burning insulation. Tommy Sullivan's education began in the smell of overheated transformers and the crackle of shorted circuits. His father worked the cranes at Cleveland's shipyards on Lake Erie, hauling steel that would become destroyer hulls and merchant vessels. His uncle ran a radio repair shop on East 55th Street, wedged between a butcher and a polish bakery, where the backroom became Sullivan's laboratory. By 12, Tommy could diagnose failing capacitors by the smell of burning insulation, sweet and acrid, like electrical death. By 15, he was rebuilding commercial radios in his uncle's workshop, experimenting with antenna configurations that made engineering students shake their heads. He'd mount receiving antennas backwards, reverse polarity on circuits, ignore frequency allocations that textbooks declared sacred. Most experiments failed, spectacular, smoke-producing failures that his uncle would laugh about while Sullivan took notes on what went wrong. But some configurations worked better than anything RCA or Motorola manufactured. Sullivan could pull radio stations from Detroit and Pittsburgh with crystal clarity using antenna orientations that violated basic electromagnetic theory or seemed to, until you understood what Sullivan understood about wave polarization and real-world signal propagation. His uncle's philosophy became Sullivan's religion, engineers designed by the book. Mechanics fixed by what works. When Pearl Harbor shattered American neutrality on December 7, 1941, Sullivan was 17 and working full-time at the repair shop. He'd grown tall and lean, with steady hands and the kind of focus that could tune a receiver while ignoring everything else in the room. The day after his 18th birthday, he walked into the Navy recruiting office on Superior Avenue and requested radio training specifically. The Navy was hungry for radio operators. Modern warfare ran on radio communication, ship to ship, ship to shore, aircraft to carrier. Every destroyer, every convoy escort, every submarine needed trained radio men who could maintain equipment, decode messages, operate direction-finding gear that tracked enemy transmissions. Sullivan arrived at Great Lakes Naval Training Station outside Chicago in February 1942, one of 200 recruits in the communications training program. The instructor, Chief Petty Officer Walter Barnes, was a 20-year Navy veteran who'd served on battleships and cruisers, who knew radio theory the way priests know scripture. Barnes watched Sullivan for 3 weeks before saying anything. Watched him mount practice antennas backwards, watched him reverse receiver polarity, watched him ignore standard tuning procedures and frequency allocations. Then Barnes pulled Sullivan aside after class and asked a simple question: "Why do you do everything wrong?" Sullivan's response became legend at radio school, repeated by instructors for the rest of the war. Dead men follow doctrine. Live ones hear signals nobody else catches. Barnes stared at him for 10 seconds, then nodded once. "Show me what you hear," Sullivan demonstrated. Using equipment that Barnes had certified as properly configured, Sullivan could barely receive the test transmission from the base's practice transmitter to miles away. Then Sullivan made his modifications vertical antenna orientation, reversed ground plane, non-standard tuning sequence. The signal came through perfectly, stronger and clearer than standard configuration achieved. Barnes checked the theory, consulted textbooks, ran calculations. Sullivan's configuration shouldn't work better. Electromagnetic propagation theory said horizontal antennas were optimal for horizontal transmission paths at the same altitude. Sullivan's vertical orientation should perform worse, but it didn't. In practical field conditions, with real equipment and actual signal propagation, Sullivan's non-standard configuration outperformed doctrine. Barnes made a note in Sullivan's training file: exceptional practical ability, terrible adherence to procedure. Recommended for advanced training if he survives long enough to be useful. Sullivan graduated second in his class not because of technical knowledge scores, which were average, but because of practical results. When the final examination required receiving a weak transmission through atmospheric interference, Sullivan was the only student who successfully decoded the entire message. He'd modified his receiver antenna orientation while other students struggled with standard equipment. His philosophy was simple, almost naive in its directness. Equipment manuals tell you what should work in theory. The ocean tells you what works in reality. Listen to the ocean. The ships that didn't make it Sullivan transferred to destroyer USS Benson in February 1943, assigned to North Atlantic convoy escort duty. The Benson had a reputation that made experienced sailors request transfers. For convoy runs, 3 U-boat contacts that resulted in merchant ship losses. The previous radio man, Petty Officer Carl Morrison, survived but couldn't continue after watching a tanker explode for 100 yards from his position. Morrison told the communications officer before transferring, "Those submarines get too close before we detect them. We're always reacting, never preventing. The equipment arrives too late to save anyone." Sullivan volunteered for the position immediately. Not because he was brave, though he was, but because he understood the problem Morrison described. Standard Allied detection equipment in early 1943 had fatal timing gaps. Destroyers used Type 128 ASTIC sonar for underwater detection. Effective range, 1,500 yards against submerged submarines. But German U-boats approached convoys on the surface at night, running on diesel engines, invisible to sonar until they submerged. By the time ASDIC detected them, torpedoes were already in the water. Radio direction finding equipment could track submarines when they transmitted. But German submarine doctrine emphasized radio silence during approach. U-boats would coordinate through brief transmissions before attack, transmit position reports after torpedoes launched, but maintain complete silence while approaching. The attack happened before the defense activated. Sullivan's first convoy was February 4, 1943, convoy on 165, 51 merchant ships carrying steel and grain from Halifax to Britain. 3 U-boats attacked on the second night. Sullivan detected nothing until after the first torpedo hit. SS William Clark, a Liberty ship carrying steel beams and grain, took the torpedoes to the engine room at O2 for 3 hours. The explosions broke the ship in half. It sank in for minutes, 47 crew. Sullivan heard the distress call, heard men screaming in the water, heard the communications officer ordering search patterns that arrived too late to matter. The Benson picked up 12 survivors. 35 died in water so cold it stopped your heart in 10 minutes, or went down with the ship, trapped in compartments that flooded before they could escape. Sullivan checked his equipment after the attack. Everything functioned within specifications. Receiver sensitivity met factory standards. Antenna orientation matched technical manual diagrams. Direction finding calibration passed all tests. But 47 men were dead because his equipment detected threats too late. The second loss came 3 days later, SS Margaret Hayes, ammunition ship. One torpedo, catastrophic explosion. The blast wave cracked windows on the Benson 800 yards away. The fireball climbed 500 feet into the night sky, no survivors. 83 crew vaporized instantly, bodies never recovered. Names carved on memorials because there was nothing left to bury. Sullivan had detected nothing before the attack. The U-boat transmitted a brief contact report afterward, almost gloating. Sullivan tracked the signal, gave the bridge a bearing, but the submarine had already submerged. The destroyer dropped depth charges on estimated position. Probably missed, definitely too late. That night, Sullivan couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, listening to the rumble of depth charges from other escorts hunting submarines that had already killed. The sound made his stomach clench with something worse than fear-helpless rage at equipment that worked perfectly according to Navy standards, but failed to save lives. The third loss was personal, February 8th, 03 for 2 hours. SS Robert Chen, troop transport carrying 400 soldiers to Iceland, single torpedo to the bow. The ship didn't sink immediately, gave men time to abandon ship, launch lifeboats, put on life vests. But North Atlantic water temperature was 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Men died from hypothermia in their lifeboats before rescue ships arrived. Final count, 127 soldiers, 31 crew. Sullivan had worked with the Robert Chen's radio man, Adam Morrison from Baltimore. They trained together at Great Lakes, shared cigarettes between convoy runs, talked about getting back to normal life after the war. Morrison planned to open a radio shop like Sullivan's uncle ran. They discussed it for hours, what equipment to stock, how to price repairs, whether television would replace radio after the war ended. Morrison died in the water before the Benson reached his lifeboat. His hands were frozen to his life vest, his face was blue. He'd been alive 20 minutes earlier, laughing about post-war plans while his ship steamed through darkness. Sullivan helped pull Morrison's body aboard, helped carry him below, helped wrap him in canvas for burial. His hands were steady, no visible reaction, but something broke inside Sullivan that night, not his nerve, but his willingness to accept that regulations mattered more than results. The theory nobody taught Sullivan went to the communications officer that afternoon. Lieutenant James Whitaker, Annapolis graduate, regulation-oriented, career Navy. Sullivan asked if there was any way to improve detection range, get earlier warning before U-boats reached attack position. Whitaker checked equipment logs, everything within specifications. Receiver sensitivity matched factory ratings. Antenna installation followed technical manual standards perfectly. The officer's conclusion was clear. Equipment wasn't the problem. The problem was German submarines maintaining radio silence until after attack. Physics limited what radio direction finding could accomplish. There was no way to detect submarines that weren't transmitting. Sullivan wasn't satisfied. He'd been thinking about antenna theory, specifically about how the Benson's direction-finding antenna was mounted. Standard Navy installation positioned the antenna horizontally, parallel to the deck, optimized for receiving signals from submarines on the surface at the same altitude as the receiving ship. Made perfect sense according to electromagnetic theory. Horizontal polarization for horizontal transmission paths. Textbook correct. But Sullivan knew something the engineers hadn't considered. U-boats approaching on the surface were truly horizontal. Ocean swells created constant pitch and roll. A submarine riding 8-foot waves was effectively transmitting from a tilted antenna, sometimes tilted 15 or 20 degrees from horizontal. And tilted transmission meant partially vertical polarization. Sullivan did rough calculations in his notebook. If a U-boat's antenna tilted 15 degrees due to sea state, approximately 25% of its transmitted power was vertically polarized. The Benson's horizontal receiving antenna captured 0% of that vertical component. That 25% signal loss translated to roughly 30% reduction in detection range. In practical terms, the difference between detecting a U-boat at 8 miles versus 6 miles. 2 miles of warning, 10 minutes of response time. The difference between interception and merchant ship losses. Sullivan mentioned this to Whitaker. The lieutenant checked the theory with the ship's engineering officer. The engineering officer consulted technical manuals, confirmed that Navy standard antenna orientation was horizontal per electromagnetic theory, and stated that changing orientation would require modification approval from Bureau of Ships. Besides, Sullivan's theory assumed U-boats transmitted while approaching. German doctrine was radio silence until after attack. Early detection was impossible regardless of antenna orientation. The conversation ended there officially, but Sullivan had stopped caring about official channels after watching Morrison die. He took a spare whip antenna from damaged equipment store salvaged from a destroyer that had taken a shell hit to the communications room, mounted it vertically in an unused antenna port on the Benson's superstructure, connected it to his direction-finding receiver through an improvised matching network built from salvaged capacitors and copper wire scavenged from electrical spares. The modification took 3 days of careful work during midnight watches when most of the crew was asleep and nobody questioned why the radio man was tinkering with equipment. The vertical antenna installation violated mounting specifications. The improvised matching network used non-standard components. The entire configuration existed nowhere in Navy technical documentation, but it worked. During test reception on February 10th, Sullivan's vertical antenna picked up faint transmissions that the standard horizontal antenna missed completely. Brief signals, probably German, weather reports or navigation checks, not tactical communications, but proof that U-boats occasionally broke radio silence even during approach phases. And proof that vertical polarization captured signals the standard antenna ignored. Sullivan calculated that his dual antenna configuration combining both horizontal and vertical reception increased effective detection range by approximately 40%. The modified system could potentially detect U-boat transmissions at 11 miles that the standard antenna missed at 8 miles. 3 miles of additional warning, 15 minutes more time to respond. The question was whether 3 miles and 15 minutes mattered enough to justify violating every regulation in the communications manual. Sullivan thought about Morrison frozen to his life vest. Thought about 47 crew from the William Clark. Thought about 127 soldiers from the Robert Chen dying in water so cold it felt like knives. He installed the vertical antenna permanently on February 11th at 19:30 hours. Used proper mounting hardware this time, made it look like standard equipment, routed the cable through existing conduit so it wasn't obviously unauthorized. The installation took 45 minutes. When finished, the vertical antenna appeared to be factory equipment. Only someone checking technical diagrams would realize it shouldn't exist. Sullivan told nobody. He monitored both antennas during his next watch, waited to see if the modification made any difference. At 02 for 7 hours on February 12, 1943, it did. The signal that changed everything. Convoy HX-24 consisted of 43 merchant ships arranged in 9 columns, escorted by 6 destroyers and 2 corvettes. Mixed cargo, ammunition, aviation fuel, vehicles, food supplies, replacement parts, and 8,000 troops American soldiers bound for Britain, training for the eventual invasion of occupied Europe. Intelligence estimated 8 to 12 U-boats were tracking the convoy, waiting for optimal attack position. Standard Wolfpack tactics, multiple submarines coordinating attack from different bearings, overwhelming escort defenses through simultaneous torpedo launches. The convoy steamed through heavy seas, 8-foot swells, wind 30 knots, ice forming on every exposed surface. Temperature barely above freezing even inside heated compartments. Sullivan was on watch in the Benson's communications room. The ship rolled in the swells. His breath fogged in dim red lighting designed to preserve night vision. He monitored both antennas, the standard horizontal antenna and his unauthorized vertical installation. At 02 for 7 hours, the vertical antenna detected a faint signal. Brief transmission, perhaps 2 seconds. Frequency consistent with German naval communications. The horizontal antenna caught nothing. The signal was too weak. Buried in atmospheric noise, Sullivan checked the bearing. Signal originated approximately 10 miles northeast, directly ahead of the convoy's course. He waited. 30 seconds later, another brief transmission. Same bearing. This time both antennas detected it, but the vertical antenna showed 40% stronger signal strength. Sullivan's pulse quickened. A U-boat was breaking radio silence ahead of the convoy, probably coordinating with other submarines, and the vertical antenna was detecting it earlier and more clearly than standard equipment. He reported to the bridge immediately. Lieutenant Commander Frank Mitchell, the officer of the deck, came to the communications room personally. Sullivan showed him the signal traces on both antennas, pointed out the significant strength difference. Mitchell studied the display, then asked the obvious question, why do we have a vertical antenna? That's not standard installation. Sullivan explained the modification. The theory, the unauthorized installation, expected reprimand, possibly court-martial for unauthorized equipment modifications in combat conditions. Mitchell listened without interrupting, then asked a different question, does it work better? Sullivan showed him the signal strength comparison. Vertical antenna detecting transmissions, the horizontal antenna missed or caught weakly. Mitchell made his decision in 5 seconds. Keep monitoring. I'm alerting the convoy commodore. The Benson altered course toward the contact bearing. Increased speed to 24 knots, fast enough to close distance, slow enough to maintain ASDIC effectiveness. Sullivan continued monitoring both antennas. At 03:03 hours, his vertical antenna detected another transmission. Different bearing 9 miles northwest, a second U-boat. At 03:18 hours, a third contact, 12 miles north-northeast. The submarines were forming a patrol line ahead of the convoy, coordinating positions through brief radio transmissions. Standard U-boat Wolfpack tactics, except Sullivan was detecting their coordination messages before they completed setup. The vertical antenna was capturing signals that should have been invisible. Turning defense into attack, Mitchell called an emergency conference at 03:30 hours, all escort commanders via radio link. He explained Sullivan's antenna modification, the enhanced detection capability, the 3 U-boat contacts ahead of the convoy that hadn't yet attacked. The convoy commodore's initial reaction was skeptical. Unauthorized equipment modifications violated regulations. Radio men didn't have authority to alter communications equipment without Bureau of Ships approval, but the detection data was undeniable. 3 confirmed bearings on submarines that hadn't yet attacked. The tactical advantage was obvious and unprecedented. The Commodore made a decision that violated every chapter of convoy defense doctrine. Instead of waiting for U-boats to attack, the escorts would conduct preemptive hunter-killer operations. They would destroy or scatter the submarine patrol line before it reached attack position. It was aggressive, risky, completely contrary to standard procedures that emphasized protecting the convoy through defensive positioning. But standard procedures were costing merchant ships and lives. The Benson and destroyer USS Madison raced ahead of the convoy at flank speed, targeting the northeasternmost contact. Sullivan continuously updated bearings as the submarine transmitted brief messages, probably reporting destroyer movements to other U-boats in the patrol line. At 04 for 7 hours, the Benson's ASDIC detected submerged contact at 1,200 yards. The U-boat had detected destroyer propeller sounds. Crash dive to evade. Too late. The Benson dropped a full pattern of depth charges. 8 canisters set for 150 feet detonation depth. The ocean erupted in massive geysers visible despite darkness. Sullivan felt the explosions through the ship's hull, concussive waves that rattled equipment and made his teeth ache. 30 seconds later, debris surfaced, wood fragments, oil slick spreading across black water, pieces of rubber, life vest material, probable kill. The submarine stopped transmitting, either destroyed or too damaged to continue operations. Either way, threat neutralized. The second U-boat contact was smarter. It detected the escorts approaching, transmitted a brief warning message to other submarines, then went silent and deep. The Madison dropped depth charges on estimated position but scored no confirmed hits. But the submarine was forced away from the convoy route. Mission accomplished, threat neutralized through disruption, if not destruction. Sullivan's vertical antenna detected a fourth contact at 0512 hours, 11 miles west-northwest. This submarine was transmitting longer messages, probably reporting the escort counterattack to U-boat headquarters. Fatal mistake. Sullivan got an excellent bearing fix. The Benson and corvette HMS Clematis converged on the position from different angles, trapping the submarine between two escort vessels. At 053 hours, the Clematis caught the U-boat on the surface, illuminated it with searchlight, opened fire with 4-inch deck gun. 3 hits on the conning tower before the submarine crash dived, trailing oil and listing badly. The corvette dropped depth charges immediately. The pattern was perfectly placed over the diving submarine's trajectory. At 0537 hours, a massive underwater explosion sent a shock wave through both escort ships. Oil and debris erupted to the surface in a geyser 30 feet high. Bodies floated up, German submariners killed instantly by the blast. Confirmed kill. Sullivan heard the cheering over the radio circuit. 2 U-boats destroyed. 1 damaged and scattered, 1 driven off. And the convoy hadn't been attacked yet. The tactical situation had completely reversed. Instead of U-boats hunting merchant ships, escorts were hunting U-boats with devastating effectiveness. The Wolfpack breaks between 0545 and 0830 hours. Sullivan's vertical antenna detected 7 more U-boat transmissions. Brief, cautious signals. The submarines were confused and disorganized. Their carefully coordinated patrol line had been shattered before completing formation. Several were transmitting damage reports. Others requested instructions. The Wolfpack coordination had collapsed into chaos. Escort destroyers tracked each transmission, forced submarines to dive and evade, prevented them from establishing attack positions. The U-boats couldn't coordinate, couldn't regroup, couldn't execute their planned attack. At 0915 hours, Sullivan detected what sounded like a German tactical recall order. Long transmission from presumably a U-boat commander ordering the patrol to break off and regroup elsewhere. The submarines were retreating. The convoy continued unmolested. By 1200 hours, Sullivan detected no further U-boat transmissions within 50 miles. The threat had evaporated. Convoy HX-24 reached Britain 6 days later without losing a single ship. 43 merchant vessels delivered intact. 8,000 troops arrived safely. All cargo, ammunition, fuel, supplies delivered without loss. 0 casualties. It was unprecedented. Most Atlantic convoys lost 3 to 5 ships minimum. Some lost a dozen or more. But HX-24's escorts had used Sullivan's early warning to dismantle the U-boat patrol line before it became lethal. The Benson docked at Londonderry on February 18th. Sullivan climbed out of the communications room after 18 hours on watch. His hands were steady, no shakes, no visible stress. But he just participated in something extraordinary, a perfect defensive victory achieved through equipment that was supposed to exist and tactics that violated doctrine. When innovation becomes doctrine, the convoy commodore, Captain Robert Hayes, interviewed Sullivan personally the next morning. Hayes had commanded convoy escorts for 18 months, had lost 17 merchant ships to U-boats during that time, over 600 sailors dead on his watch. He wanted to understand how one radio man with unauthorized equipment had accomplished what standard doctrine consistently failed to achieve. Sullivan explained his antenna theory again. Vertical polarization capturing signal components that horizontal antennas missed. 40% detection range improvement translating to critical early warning. Hayes listened carefully, then asked the question that would change naval warfare. Can you teach this to other radio men? Sullivan said yes, but the modification violated regulations. Installing unauthorized equipment could result in disciplinary action, possibly court-martial for equipment tampering in combat conditions. Hayes made his decision immediately. I'm recommending your modification for fleet-wide adoption. Regulations can be modified faster than we can replace lost merchant ships. Word spread through the destroyer escort community before official channels could react. Radio men heard about Sullivan's vertical antenna through informal networks, the whispered conversations in equipment spaces, the cigarette break discussions between convoy runs. Some communications officers refused modifications, citing regulations and lack of authorization. Others were willing to experiment if it improved detection and saved ships. Sullivan showed them how. Salvage a spare whip antenna, mount it vertically. Build an improvised matching network from capacitors and wire. Monitor both horizontal and vertical polarization. Takes 3 days of careful work, changes everything. The modification spread like underground resistance, radio man to radio man, ship to ship. No official documentation, no engineering approval. Just practical knowledge shared between people who understood that doctrine killed men and innovation saved them. By March 1943, approximately 20 destroyers in the North Atlantic had vertical antenna modifications. The tactical results became impossible to ignore. Ships using dual polarization antennas detected transmissions at significantly greater ranges than ships with standard equipment. They got earlier warning, more time to respond. Better tactical positioning. Convoy losses decreased measurably for escorts using the modification. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell compiled statistics in March. Convoys escorted by ships with standard antennas. Average loss rate 8.2%. Convoys with at least 2 modified escorts. Average loss rate 3.7%. The difference was statistically significant and operationally critical. Thousands of lives, hundreds of ships, millions of tons of cargo. All saved by one radio man's backwards thinking. The enemy prospective German U-boat commanders noticed the change by late March. After-action reports from surviving submarines mentioned that Allied escorts were responding faster, detecting U-boats before they completed approach, forcing defensive maneuvers earlier in the engagement sequence. Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Schmidt commanded U-552, one of Germany's most successful submarines, with 23 merchant ships sunk. On March 28, 1943, Schmidt attempted to attack Convoy ON-176 using standard Wolfpack procedures. He transmitted a brief position report at 0340 hours, confirming his approach vector to other submarines in the patrol. Standard procedure, brief transmission that shouldn't provide enough signal for accurate Allied direction finding. 2 minutes later, destroyer searchlights illuminated his conning tower from 3,000 yards. Impossible. The destroyers shouldn't have detected his transmission that quickly. Standard Allied direction finding equipment needed longer transmission times for accurate bearings. Something had changed. Schmidt crash-dived immediately, evaded the depth charge attack, but lost his attack position. The convoy escaped. His after-action report stated, Allied detection capabilities have improved significantly. Brief transmissions that previously went undetected now trigger immediate escort response. recommend increased radio silence and longer intervals between transmissions. Other commanders filed similar reports throughout March and April. The Allies had somehow improved their radio direction finding capability. German naval intelligence analyzed captured Allied equipment from damaged destroyers. Found nothing unusual: standard radio receivers, standard horizontal antennas, standard direction finding circuits. Whatever the Allies had changed wasn't visible in hardware examinations. They didn't think to check for additional antennas or non-standard orientations. Sullivan's vertical antenna looked enough like original equipment that German analysts missed it completely hidden in plain sight, a simple wire that German intelligence dismissed as standard installation. But that simple wire was detecting U-boat transmissions that horizontal antennas missed, giving Allied escorts the critical early warning that turned defensive convoy protection into offensive submarine hunting. Official recognition that never came. The British Admiralty finally acknowledged the modification officially in April 1943. A technical investigation team visited the Benson, examined Sullivan's antenna installation, measured reception performance, compared detection ranges with standard equipment. Their conclusion matched Sullivan's original theory. Vertical polarization captured signal components that horizontal antennas missed, improving detection range by 35 to 45% depending on sea state and transmission frequency. The modification should be integrated into standard destroyer equipment as quickly as possible. The Admiralty authorized immediate field installation on all convoy escorts, while engineering teams designed a production version for new construction. By summer 1943, vertical antenna installations became standard equipment on all Allied convoy escorts in the Atlantic. But Sullivan never received official recognition for the innovation. No commendation, no medal, no mention in Admiralty reports. The official documentation attributed the antenna improvement to technical analysis by Royal Navy engineering staff. Sullivan's name didn't appear in any official record. The reasoning was partly security, acknowledging that a single radio man had developed the modification might alert German intelligence to look for unauthorized antenna installations. But mostly it was bureaucratic inertia. Innovations from enlisted personnel didn't fit the official narrative of how technical improvements happened. Engineering advances were supposed to come from research laboratories and design committees, not from radio men jury-rigging equipment in combat zones. Sullivan didn't care about recognition. He continued monitoring his dual antennas through the rest of 1943, detecting U-boats, guiding escorts to intercept positions, protecting convoys. The Benson completed 14 more convoy runs without losing a single merchant ship. The turning tide by summer 1943, the tactical balance in the North Atlantic had shifted dramatically. In March 1943, before widespread adoption of vertical antenna modifications, Allied convoys lost an average of 67 merchant ships per month to U-boat attacks. By July 1943, losses had dropped to 18 ships per month. Multiple factors contributed: better air cover, improved ASTIC technology, increased escort numbers, growing German submarine losses depleting experienced crews. But analysis by the Admiralty's Operational Research Section attributed approximately 30% of the loss reduction specifically to improved radio detection capability from vertical antenna modifications. 30%, roughly 15 ships per month. 180 ships per year, thousands of lives. The psychological impact on German submarine crews was devastating. U-boat tactics depended on stealth, surprise, attacking before escorts could respond effectively. When Allied destroyers began detecting submarines during their approach phase, sometimes detecting coordination messages before the attack even began, German commanders lost their primary advantage. Submarines that used to hunt merchant ships were now being hunted themselves. Crew morale deteriorated. Many experienced commanders were killed or captured. Replacement crews lacked the training and confidence of veterans. By August 1943, German Admiral Dönitz temporarily withdrew U-boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging that losses exceeded sustainable rates. The withdrawal marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied convoys could cross with dramatically reduced losses. The supply line to Britain stabilized. The eventual invasion of occupied Europe became logistically feasible. Sullivan's role in that victory remained hidden after the war. Sullivan was reassigned to Training Command in September 1943, spent the rest of the war teaching radio direction finding techniques to new radio men at the Communications School in Portsmouth. He showed hundreds of students how to build and install vertical antennas, how to monitor dual polarization, how to extract maximum performance from standard equipment through non-standard configurations. His favorite saying became doctrine among radio operators: the equipment manual tells you what should work. The ocean tells you what does work. Listen to the ocean. After the war, Sullivan returned to Cleveland, worked at his uncle's radio shop for 3 years, then opened his own electronics repair business in 1948. He fixed televisions, installed antennas, built custom equipment. Never mentioned the war. When customers asked about his military service, he'd say he was a radio man, monitored communications, nothing special. In 1967, a naval historian researching destroyer operations in the Atlantic found references to unauthorized antenna modifications in equipment maintenance logs from 1943. The historian tracked down Sullivan through veteran registries. Sullivan was 42 years old by then, running a successful electronics business, raising 2 children. The historian asked about the vertical antenna modification. Sullivan confirmed the story, said it was just basic electromagnetic theory applied practically, nothing revolutionary. Just using physics that textbooks taught, but equipment designers ignored. The historian estimated that Sullivan's antenna modification contributed to saving approximately 400 merchant ships and 20,000 lives, based on loss rate reductions in convoys protected by modified escorts. Sullivan said he never counted ships or lives. He just remembered the convoys that made it through. HX-2-4 on 176, SC-1-2, HX-229A ships that arrived intact because his antenna detected threats early enough to matter. That was enough. The photograph on the wall: Thomas Sullivan died in 1990 at age 69. He was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Cleveland. His obituary mentioned his distinguished service in the Navy, his electronics business, his wife Helen, 2 children. One paragraph mentioned his war service: radio operator, destroyer escort, North Atlantic convoys. The obituary didn't mention the vertical antenna, didn't mention 400 ships saved, didn't mention 20,000 lives, didn't mention how one Cleveland radio man changed submarine detection doctrine for every Navy that studied his methods. His electronics shop still exists, different owner now, but on the wall in the back office, there's a faded photograph. A young radio man in working uniform standing next to a whip antenna mounted vertically on a destroyer's superstructure. The date written on the back: February 1943, USS Benson. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through engineering committees or official channels or research laboratories with unlimited funding. Through radio men who see problems clearly, who find solutions practically, who don't wait for authorization to save lives. Through mechanics who understand that textbooks explain what should work, but the ocean cold, unforgiving, littered with men who follow doctrine the ocean tells you what actually does. Sullivan listened to the ocean, changed warfare, saved thousands. Then went back to Cleveland and fixed radios for 40 years without mentioning it once. That's the story, not the one in official records. Not the one that engineering committees claimed credit for, but the true one. The story of how one unauthorized wire, installed in darkness by a radio man who trusted results over regulations, rewrote naval warfare and turned the tide of the Atlantic.